No weapon ever invented is as destructive as the nuclear-armed ballistic missile. Over the past decades, intense work has been underway to develop ways to defend against the ballistic missile threat. Come with us as we take a look at the new technologies of the missile shield. Protecting cities against the threat of enemy forces is as old as warfare itself. Since antiquity, fortifications and castles were the primary means of strategic defense. As cannon grew in power, fortified cities became more vulnerable to enemy attack. The advent of strategic bombers early in the century meant that new forms of defenses were needed. Anti-aircraft guns and radar sprouted up around the major cities of Europe and Asia in an attempt to stave off the bomber threat. By the 1950s, anti-aircraft missiles were replacing guns. The missiles were more accurate and more destructive. But missile technology was a double-edged sword. It could not only defend, it could attack. By the late 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union had developed offensive ballistic missiles which could destroy one another's cities using nuclear warheads. It seemed to many that it would be impossible to defend against such devastating weapons. But others believed it would be possible to destroy one missile with another missile. This began a secret technological struggle between engineers designing offensive missiles and other engineers designing defensive missiles to protect cities and military objectives. In 1962, an experimental Nike Zeus missile succeeded in intercepting an intercontinental ballistic missile for the first time. The Nike Zeus was the first step in America's anti-ballistic missile program. By the late 1960s, Nike Zeus evolved into the Sentinel program. Sentinel used two missiles. The long-range Spartan attacked the incoming missile up in space, outside the atmosphere. The smaller Sprint missile then attacked any missiles that penetrated the Spartan barrier. The Sentinel ABM program was a technological marvel every bit as challenging as the space race to the moon. But military thinkers began to grow concerned about what ABM missiles meant in the tense Cold War relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. There were fears that a ballistic missile shield would lead both sides to build more and more offensive missiles to overwhelm the growing defensive barrier. As a result, in 1972, both sides agreed to place very strict limits on defensive missiles under the ABM Treaty. The United States deployed missiles at a single site in North Dakota in 1974 as part of a small, limited ABM network called Safeguard. Safeguard could only provide limited defense against a small-scale attack, and it was soon closed as uneconomical. In the 1980s, President Reagan initiated a new defensive program called SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, popularly called Star Wars. SDI was a research program aimed at developing new technologies. Exotic new concepts such as high-energy lasers, particle beam weapons, and space-based weapons were tested. But President Reagan's dream of a defensive missile shield in space ultimately proved stillborn. The program was controversial due to its costs and to doubts that it could defend against a massive Soviet attack. The Enormous political changes in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in the late 1980s marked an end of the Cold War and an end of the Cold War threats. But with the end of the Cold War came reminders of other threats. During the 1991 Gulf War, the Iraqis used Scud missiles to terror bomb Saudi and Israeli cities. In an historic burst, Patriot missiles were used to defend the cities against the Scud missile attacks. The Gulf War was a reminder that the United States has no means to defend its own cities against ballistic missiles. While the Patriot has some capability against very short-range missiles like the Scud, it is not designed to deal with the much faster intercontinental missiles. To defend American cities, a new system would be needed.
Patriot is capable of dealing with only short-range missiles. As the range of a ballistic missile increases, the velocity at which it flies increases, and the ability of the missile to fly out and hit the target is affected by how fast the target is coming in. Against the class of missiles that we dealt with in the Gulf, Patriot was capable of defending a footprint of perhaps 10 kilometers in diameter or something like that. Fairly small footprint. When you get to the strategic class of missile, Patriot and that class of missile would have zero capability to defend against the class of missiles that fly 10,000 kilometers. One needs a much faster missile that flies out further and can actually fly up into space where these re-entry vehicles are coming in.
In 1990, the SDI program was restructured to face the changing realities of the world sea. The aim was to develop systems to defend against the more limited threats of the 1990s, and so was called GPALS, Global Protection Against Limited Strikes.
About 2 years ago, President Bush refocused the program from one which was intended to enhance deterrence, offensive deterrence, to one which was aimed at protecting the United States, our friends and allies, and our troops abroad against ballistic missile strikes, smaller ballistic missile strikes from whatever their source. The reason why that is of concern is the disintegration of the Soviet Union raises the concerns about the potential for accidental or unauthorized strike. The proliferation of ballistic missiles in the Third World has raised a concern that certainly in the theater early on, but in the time frame that we have to get ready for, the United States may be under continued threat from ballistic missiles, as we saw in the Gulf War. So that's the reason for being ready for ballistic missile defense.
In order to understand how GPALS will work, it is necessary to understand how its target, the ballistic missile, works. After launch, the missile goes through a series of events which drastically change the nature of the target.
The part nearest the launch is called the boost phase, and that's when the ICBM is firing and leaving the ground, and it carries on it one or more re-entry vehicles or penetration aid packages, depending on whether it's a multiple system or a single system. Once that it's carried that package up above the sensible atmosphere and gotten it into space, then the booster or boosters, because there may be multiple stages, are kicked off and ejected and fall to the earth, and that package that remains goes on into a ballistic trajectory. And frankly, you have to admit that technically it's a fantastic achievement to think that over ranges of 10,000 kilometers, those packages can be made to hit the ground within a few hundred meters of where you want them to go. Okay, so at the end of boost phase, we have a busing phase, and that's when the hardware that's left, the top end of this missile, sets out its re-entry vehicles, its real weapons, its nuclear bombs, if you will, on paths that are predetermined that will let them impact in the target area where we want them to go. And all of this happens within the first 5 minutes, 6 minutes, if you will, of some 25-minute flight path. During this time, if there are going to be any intentional penetration aids, decoys and stuff like that, they would be deployed. Okay, and so the weapons then traverse that path. When they get to the atmosphere again, reentry is a very difficult technical problem, because the friction of the atmosphere at those extremely high velocities makes it very important that the reentry vehicles be able to survive. They can. But they come into the atmosphere, and so the last minute of this flight is when they enter the atmosphere and hit the ground and detonate, or whatever is going to happen. And we call that the endo-atmospheric phase. So if you looked at this whole 25 minutes, if you will, of flight path, you had maybe 5 minutes or so in the boost phase, another few minutes in the post-boost phase when we're busing, a long period of time, some 20 minutes in exo-atmospheric flight, and then a minute or so for the reentry.
The task of the current SDI program is to develop a defensive shield that can be put in place by the turn of the century. As a result, more mature technologies, such as missiles, are receiving priority over more exotic technologies, such as lasers. But the real technical challenge is not only the missiles.
First and foremost, one needs the sensor systems that detect the launch of ballistic missiles. We have such systems now, but what we do not have are the systems that track the warheads into space as they continue on their track toward their target. And we have several programs, both radar and space optical systems, that are aimed at providing detailed trajectories on the targets for both theater and for U.S. defense. So we can tell interceptor missiles, whether those missiles might be based in space or early on they will be based on the ground. We need to be able to tell them where to go. And in order to do that, we need the sensor systems to support them.
Space-based sensors have already been tested on several shuttle missions. The aim of these programs is to study what a ballistic missile looks like in flight when viewed by different types of space-based sensors. It is also necessary to study the natural phenomena of the upper atmosphere, such as the aurora borealis, to understand what a missile will look like against such backgrounds. These new sensors will eventually be incorporated into a new type of satellite, codenamed Brilliant Eyes. These satellites will detect the trajectory of moving bodies in space, such as re-entry vehicles.
The sensors that are on board the satellite are able to see these bodies and to develop the motion that is needed to tell us two things, actually. One, is it really a threatening body? That's very important, because there are other things which accompany re-entry bodies, junk and things like that. And secondly, it's able to pass information to the interceptor that would allow the interceptor to fly to a point in space to actually do the killing job.
Sensors are the first stage of the missile shield. Once the enemy missile has been detected by the Brilliant Eyes, the next layer of the defensive system comes into action. Ground-based radars will track the incoming re-entry vehicles. The radars will sort out the real warheads from the decoys. A new missile called the Ground-Based Interceptor, or GBI, will be used to destroy the incoming re-entry vehicles. Unlike the old Safeguard program, which used a nuclear warhead, the new missile is accurate enough to destroy by simply ramming the target.
It is a non-nuclear killing interceptor. In fact, it has no warhead at all. The technique that we're using for destroying the weapon incoming is a direct impact, which means that the upper stage of the missile flies such that it collides with the incoming warhead. And when that happens, that's, these two bodies are traveling at very high relative velocity. So when they collide, it's an immense amount of destruction, and totally destroy. So we don't have what we call a lethality issue. If we hit it, it will be destroyed. In fact, the two bodies in our experiments have been turned to dust. So The interceptor then has to be able to actually collide with the incoming, which means it has to have an onboard homing system. It has a sensor which, once the interceptor is launched and it flies to a point in space, can open its eyes, if you will, find the target, and do the divert maneuver. That means fly itself such that it can make this collision.
One of the most difficult aspects of strategic defense is distinguishing the real warheads from all the decoys and debris. Here we see an actual re-entry vehicle entering the atmosphere. Ideally, it would be best to attack the missile shortly after launch, before the re-entry vehicles have separated from the bus. Furthermore, a space interception would destroy all the warheads at once. This would take a space-based interceptor. The next stage of the SDI effort, codenamed Brilliant Pebbles, is examining space-based interceptors.
There's really nothing more elaborate about a space-based interceptor than a ground-based interceptor, except where it's based. The Brilliant Pebble that we're talking about is an interceptor, just like a ground-based interceptor, that's housed in what we call a life jacket, which provides life support in space while it lives there. It is cued in the same way as a ground-based interceptor. It can enter the battle, and it runs into its target in the same way. The real advantage of a space-based interceptor is that it can deal with ballistic missiles coming up. It can get to the target sooner while it's still burning. It works in theater. It can deal with theater targets. It can deal with targets that threaten the U.S. It can deal with short-range targets. It can deal with long-range targets.
The popular vision of the SDI program has been most strongly shaped by exotic technologies such as lasers. Development of laser weapons continues, but it seems unlikely they will be actually deployed for strategic defense until the 21st century. Important milestones have already been met in the program. Ground-based lasers have been able to destroy missile fuselages. And high-energy lasers have shot down tactical missiles in the atmosphere. But substantial technical hurdles still remain, including such issues as compact power sources and the penetration of the beam through the atmosphere. Over the next several years, strategic defense is more likely to be based on missiles than on directed energy weapons. The GPAL's missile defense program now involves not only national defense of the United States from ballistic missiles, but also theater defense of American troops in the field. The need to protect troops from tactical missile attack was made evident during the Gulf War. The Patriot system proved adequate for the job, but was not originally designed for the anti-missile role. It was intended as an anti-aircraft system. The GPAL's program is now examining missiles specifically developed for the anti-missile mission as part of its theater missile defense program. As a first step, an improved version of the Patriot missile, called PAC-3, is being examined based on the lessons of the Gulf War. A completely new missile, called the Errant, is also being developed, which can be used in conjunction with the Patriot system. The Errant is so accurate that it destroys the enemy warhead by colliding with it at speeds faster than a bullet striking another bullet. The PAC-3 version of Patriot and Errant will improve defense at lower altitudes, but it is best to engage and destroy the enemy ballistic missile as far away as possible. This limits the chance it will have to cause damage on the ground from falling debris or chemical warheads. This outer defense layer, beyond Patriot and Errant, is being explored in a program called THAAD, for Theater High Altitude Air Defense. The THAAD missile is designed to intercept the enemy ballistic missile far out in space. The THAAD program has been strongly influenced by lessons from defending Saudi and Israeli cities during the Gulf War.
Well, one of the concerns that I had back during the war, if you go back and look at how we were laid out in Israel, We had 4 Patriot fire units to defend the Tel Aviv area, for example. And that really stretched each of those systems to its limit. What we're looking for in the THAAD program is a capability that goes, as you said, significantly higher, but with just 1 fire unit would cover an area significantly larger than even Tel Aviv. So you drop down to 1 fire unit capability versus the multiple that were established during the war.
Pole 2. Pole 3. GN2's down. We're go for propulsion.
One of the novel warheads being explored for space interception is called LEAP, Low Exoatmospheric Projectile. This unusual little device is launched into space on the top of a missile and then steers itself into the target.
7. We have lock on the target.
5.
High-speed cameras on. Batteries up.
LEAP may extend the missile shield into new environments. Mounted on the nose of a Navy missile, LEAP could be fired into space from U.S. Navy warships. This missile shield could be rapidly placed over areas around the globe in the event of sudden conflicts, providing a supplement to land-based systems such as THAAD. As the ballistic missile threat spreads, more and more attention will be paid to anti-missile technology. Recent advances in missile technology are moving missile defenses from the realm of science fiction to the realm of reality.